excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show John Williams, who's an economist. He's consulted with individuals as well as Fortune 500 companies, and he runs a site called ShadowStats. So, John, tell us, what is ShadowStats about?
Well, ShadowStats.com is my website, and I cover the quality of government reporting, which has generally deteriorated over the years. You've seen a lot of methodological changes that have moved the numbers away from reality, from common experience. I discovered that early on and found that I had to become somewhat of a specialist in that area. I've looked at the differences and where you've had gimmicks, and there have been a lot of gimmicks built into these numbers. I've estimated what the numbers would be without the gimmicks, and not too surprisingly, you might find that I'm looking at a much higher unemployment rate, higher inflation, and weaker economic statistics in the government's reporting.
So before we get to those details, the way you're describing it, it sounds like some kind of conspiracy. So who are the people who have developed this conspiracy to hide this true information from the public?
I don't know that it's a conspiracy so much as it is just the way the system has evolved over time. For example, I've been doing this for a number of decades now. Back in 1983, the Bureau of Labor Statistics found it had underestimated the jobs growth coming out of the steep recession of that time. So what they did was they added in a monthly bias factor to compensate for that, as it was explained to me, because that was a political embarrassment for them to understate the numbers. Okay to overstate the jobs growth, but you didn't want to understate the jobs growth. And so that you have that element. On the other hand, with the inflation numbers, there you have a very direct manipulation for effectively what I would consider very, very bad political reasons. If you go back to the 1990s, you had Alan Greenspan and others such as Michael Boskin, who's on the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, moaning and groaning that the consumer price index overstated inflation, and if they could only reduce inflation or get a more accurate reporting of inflation that showed a lower inflation, it would help them cut the deficit, the federal deficit. That cost of living adjustments would be less, and people would be pushed into higher tax brackets. All that would help the deficit. If you ask them, well, how is the CPI overstated? And the explanation was, well, you have a circumstance where, let's say, steak prices get too expensive. Well, people will buy more hamburger or chicken, and they're not spending as much, and thus their cost of living isn't as much. Well, that might be one definition of inflation, but the way that most people look at it, and the way it had been viewed for centuries, was that inflation was measured in terms of a constant standard of living, or the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living. And the reason you want to do that is that people would commonly use an inflation measure to estimate how much their income had to go up so they could continue to live as they were, or to target their investment return. But what they tried to do here, and in fact what they did here, was that they moved away from the concept of a constant standard of living. They put in substitution factors. They also added what they called hedonic quality adjustments, which had the effect of reducing inflation for improved quality that in products that the consumer really didn't recognize. So the effect was that we're up through the 1990s, the consumer price index had been a fairly consistent and good number in terms of estimating on what an average cost of living was for a constant standard of living. It no longer measures that. It no longer measures out-of-pocket expenses either. So that it's what they came up with was a CPI designed specifically for government use and to maximize the government's financial return at the expense of the general public and giving the public bad information where they're not covering inflation when they look at the government CPI numbers. That was never explained to the public, and that I really think was effectively criminal.
Okay, so you heard it here first on the Goldstein on Gelt Show. We're talking with economist John Williams, who runs a site called ShadowStats. John, you've been explaining to us an issue about inflation, so now I'm wondering how this could actually injure someone who is an investor. For example, one of the types of investments that a lot of people say they'll buy in order to protect them against the ravages of inflation is they say, I'll buy what are called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. These are like treasury bonds, but they have a linkage to inflation. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the way the government is going to calculate inflation is not the real inflation that, John and Mary have on Main Street, and they're going to be feeling a much greater inflation than the government is reporting, and because the tips only inflate at the rate that the government reports, John and Mary on Main Street are actually not keeping up with inflation. Is that the problem?
That is correct. Absolutely. In fact, I find if you want to have a good sense of what's going on, talk to John and Mary on Main Street. They have a very good sense of reality. The average guy will tell you, I'm not keeping up with inflation.
Right, and I think one of the other inflation areas that people often touch on, for example, is with senior citizens who their Social Security may only go up by the cost of living adjustment, but their actual cost of living is growing at a much greater rate because healthcare inflation is admittedly much higher and maybe even higher than the government admits as well.
Yes, well, there are two factors there. One is a general understatement of inflation, and the other is that really for cost of living adjustments for Social Security, they should use an inflation measure that's more oriented towards older retired people because their spending patterns and actual inflation is different than the people who are raising children. So there are a couple of areas there, but the way it was set up, which was the general CPI inflation, they use a slightly different one. What they call the CPIWs for the wage earners, more sensitive gasoline prices and such. That all the CPI numbers except the chained CPI, the one that they're coming in with, which will give you even lower inflation than the CPI gives you now, the one that's being groomed to actually artificially reduce the inflation rate more. All the others are subject to the problems I mentioned in terms of not measuring the cost of maintaining a constant standard of living.
Okay, so let's just switch gears for a minute here, because one of the topics I know you talk a lot about, and we only have a few minutes left, but I really want to ask you about this, is the question of unemployment. Unemployment seems like such a political figure, and obviously the president wants to say how there's very little unemployment, but you seem to think quite the opposite. Tell me, how do you define unemployment, and how do you get such a different number from the government?
Well, let me first explain to you what you're getting from the government. The government has 6 measures of unemployment. Their third measure, the U3, is the headline number that's roughly around 5%. Their broadest measure is called U6, and that's around 10%. Now, which unemployment category people fall into is a matter of definition, but they're missing a big count of people who have moved out of the labor force because they can't find work. 1994 was a turning point in the reporting. They redefined the unemployment series back then. Back then they had a category called discouraged workers. These were people who had given up looking for work because there was no work to be had. After the redefinition, the discouraged worker number that they used was for people who had not been actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, you've actively looked for work in the last 4 weeks, they'll count you in the headline U3 rate. But if it's been more than 4 weeks, but less than a year, they'll put you in the U6 rate. So the U6 rate has some measure of the discouraged worker. But that headline number, a couple of things with it. First of all, it hit a peak of about 10% at the trough of the recession, and I'll contend that recession was one from which we've never recovered, and the economy is beginning to turn down again. But that 10% has now come down to 5%. Normally, that'd be happy news, and the reason for that is when you see the unemployment rate drop, the healthy way that happens is that the number of unemployed shrinks and the number of employed grows as people come out of unemployment and they find jobs. But what has been happening here more often than not is that the number of unemployed has dropped because they've given up looking for work. They've become discouraged workers. And the way those numbers work, when that happens, that actually brings down the unemployment rate. So they see the unemployment rate shrinking, but it's bad news because these people are not finding jobs; they're becoming the long-term unemployed. Now the government does have some measures, broader measures that give you an indication of what's happening there. One is the employment to population ratio. The other is the participation rate. That's a number that Fed Chair Janet Yellen particularly looks at. It gives you a broad picture of what's happening with all the people in the environment, and those really are at record lows, or very close to record lows. And again, data before 1994 just are not comparable with what they're publishing today. But if you went out and asked everyone in the country whether or not he or she were employed or unemployed, I figure you come up with something close to 23% unemployment. Now, how I come up with that is I estimate the discouraged worker and the displaced workers as they were counted before they revised the series. And what happens is that not only, if you haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks, you pass into the discouraged worker category as it is today. If you're discouraged at the end of a year, they drop you from the U6 measure, which is their broadest measure. And so you're no longer counted in the unemployed. Before 1994, at least there'd still be a continuing count for you. I continue to look at and estimate the buildup there in the long-term unemployed, and where you find the headline U3 rate has dropped, the broader U6 rate also has dropped as the discouraged workers have dropped out of it. But if you look at them, they continue, they survive, and as a result, you'll see my rate, which is, again, up around 23%, has been fairly flat. It hasn't turned down with the other numbers, and that's because there's been a growth in these broad, displaced, long-term unemployed people. They're not being accounted for by the government.
So that's really a problem. So, John, I know we're just about out of time now, but I know that you write a lot about this, and I'd like to just ask you in the last minute, how can people learn more about your ideas and follow what's going on and really see what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, you can go to my website, which is ShadowStats.com. A lot of information there for the public. In the right-hand column, there's a report on inflation that explains what's happening there. We've got a couple of articles on the reality tied to employment, the GDP. If you overstate inflation, guess what? If you understate inflation, you're overstating inflation-adjusted growth, such as the GDP. GDP's overstated, too. All that information is available on the website. I do have a weekly newsletter that's available electronically. We always look for subscribers. Happy to pick up anyone who's interested, but there's a lot of material there for someone who just wants to get educated on what's happening with the government statistics.
Okay, so we will put a link to that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. John Williams, thanks so much for your time.
Doug, thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.